Hello, everyone, and welcome to the premiere episode of The Bryce is Right, where I admit right out of the gate, I'm not always right. I'm just right most of the time. But we'll go ahead and test that theory with each of these shows. My name is Bryce Cornell, also known as Bryce Aroni. Formerly of the EA show, some of you guys may recognize me from there. For those of you who don't, I just like to describe myself as just a guy who likes to talk about stuff. A little bit about me. I value empiricism, science, rationalism, skepticism, critical thinking, and pretty much I'm here to promote secular humanism and positive atheism because I think we need more of that. There's a few of us growing in the movement right now, and I hope to be a part of that, and I hope to do my part to grow that community as well. And the overall theme to this show is basically talking about what we need and what we desire for the human race, you know, what we want ourselves to be as a society. How do we prosper? How do we grow? And so we're going to touch on some issues related to philosophy, politics, religion, history, current events, and science, of course. And this is the premiere episode, so I have to say The Bryce is Right. This was made possible by director Wes. He's our genius in the background, without whom none of this could be possible. And I also have to give a shout out to our co-host for today and our graphic designer, Skids the Clown. Mispronouncing, almost mispronounced his name on the premiere. He's going to get me for that later. Today's topic is philosophical ethics, and we have two pretty good guests today. Fortunately, I have Mr. Max Lewis. He is a PhD in philosophy from the University of Pennsylvania, and he has an interest in ethics, epistemology, religion, philosophy of morality, language, action, and aesthetics, I believe. Do I have that right, Max?
That's correct.
All right. And so we're very excited to have you on the show. And also our second guest, Mr. Nathan Ormond. I believe I'm pronouncing that correctly.
Yeah, that's right.
Ormond. Awesome. And you are a software engineer and the host of a YouTube channel called Digital Gnosis. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah, that's correct. Yeah.
Okay. And you have an interest in philosophy and consciousness, neuroscience, mathematics, politics, and religion. Is that about it?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I'm going to do a degree in computational neuroscience next year, which I've just accepted an offer for. But it always feels a bit weird when you've not done something yet. You know, be like, oh yeah, that's what I do or something, because it isn't strictly yet. But yeah, that's right about the YouTube channel and everything. Sorry.
Okay. Well, let me start with you, Max. What do you do? Who are you? What do you do, and why do you do it?
Sure. So currently I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Helsinki on a project called Responsible Beliefs. So this is a project that's run by a couple of really excellent philosophers at the university. And it's basically concerned with the intersection of epistemology and ethics. So for those who might not be familiar, epistemology is the study of, let's just say, rational, reasonable belief or knowledge. And then ethics, I think everybody has some idea of what's involved with ethics, and we'll talk about that more, I think. But so it's sort of the intersection of those things. So how do you come to have moral knowledge? Can you gain moral knowledge just by trusting somebody's testimony? Can you wrong somebody by having certain beliefs about them? These are some of the kind of questions that I've been investigating as part of this project. Before that, I did a PhD at the University of Pennsylvania. Before that, I did a master's in philosophy at Brandeis University. And then before that, actually, I did religious studies and found that really rewarding. But once I found philosophy, I decided that, so this is to answer your second question, which was, why do I do it? Just found that incredibly fulfilling and enjoyable to think about the kind of questions that philosophers think about. And I found myself thinking, even if I wasn't particularly good at it, I'd still like to have a try. And it's one of those things where just the very process of doing it, I find enjoyable. So I thought that was a good way to spend my time.
And you mentioned religious studies. Would you consider yourself a religious person, or did you used to be at one point?
No, actually. So both my parents were atheists. I grew up being, I guess, atheist. I became interested in religious studies sort of close to the time of 9/11, which happened with a lot of people, I think. And I decided in college that I wanted to do religious studies, mainly because I was interested in why people would believe the kinds of things that lots of religious people believe. I just found it very interesting and had trouble understanding. So then after that, I didn't know if I wanted to pursue something in academia. So I did a master's in religious studies. And it was there that I decided, although it was very interesting for me, because I wasn't religious at all, I felt like I didn't have a dog in any of the fights that were going on in these sort of debates. So I found philosophy and thought, well, there's a lot of stuff that philosophers talk about that I have strong opinions about and want to know more about. So I decided to switch at that point.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And if only I had done that with my life, because I find myself talking more about philosophy now than I ever have in the past. I wonder what my perspective would be if I had followed a similar path, but that's awesome. Nathan, you are something of a student of philosophy, I hear.
Yeah, so my undergraduate degree is in software engineering, which I did whilst working, and a company kind of like funded me to do that. But during that time, I was about, like 19/20 years old when I started out in that process. And I think as a result of me sort of having depression and stuff like that, I was trying to figure out, I wanted a framework that could make sense of reality for me, and Christianity seemed to offer that for me through I was listening to people like Jordan Peterson, who seemed to offer, like hope, meaning, and purpose. And I think it was his debate with William Lane Craig, which was the first time I sort of was exposed to evangelical Christianity. And Jordan Peterson also did these lectures on a psychological interpretation of the biblical series. And that made me think, I'll go to a local church and get involved in a Bible study, where I think over time through that process, I just started adopting beliefs of the community and group that I was in, and eventually ended up becoming a Christian. Then that got me interested in philosophy. That was when I guess I wanted to do apologetics. I wanted to be able to convert people and stop them from going to hell. And, I viewed reality as spiritual warfare between, the forces of good and evil sort of thing. And then, through a process, I had conversations with people on the internet, like someone called Pine Creek, which was pretty key in my deconversion, which got me to sort of question whether I should be putting the kind of confidence in some of the quite sort of epistemically risky claims that were quite fundamental to my kind of worldview at that point. And that led me just down a road where I basically deconverted to what I now describe myself as is a local agnostic, though I do a lot of stuff opposing apologetics, where I see apologists as overstating the case for Christianity, or also I've been doing some stuff with like Islamic apologists and stuff over these past couple of weeks. And I'm doing a philosophy degree in my spare time, just because I think when you self-study, it can be really easy to deviate from like what the kind of community of people who think about these ideas, how they kind of use language, the things that they've thought about to reinvent the wheel and stuff. So I wanted to guide myself in that way to make sure I wasn't like developing weird ideas that people had already thought about, or bad ideas. And so that's why I was like, I'm gonna do a degree in my spare time, and that'll, I'll have to write essays to formulate my thoughts better, get criticism on that. So yeah, that's where I'm at currently. And like I said before, next year I've accepted an offer to do a master's in computational neuroscience, because I'm also very interested in questions in philosophy of mind. And as a naturalist now, I also think that the best way to sort of answer those questions is going to be through the sciences. But that that's another question for another day, and people can rationally disagree on that point and so forth.
It almost seems like some of these topics are intertwined and related: philosophy, psychology, neuroscience, naturalism. I consider myself to be a naturalist. I have a degree in psychology. I was a former apologist myself for Christianity who was deconverted. So we seem to have a little bit in common. You mentioned that you found Christianity at around 19 or so, and frankly, you don't look much older than that now. So
I'm 24 now. I have to think about it now. But yeah. So I was in Christianity for like 2 years ish, and then out of it, which has been like a weird time in my life. Anyway, it's all been a weird time. But yeah, we can talk about.
Yeah, no, that's great, and that's probably where the differences between the two of us would be. I was a Christian for the majority of my life. I'm older than 24, and some of the people watching probably know how old I actually am, and I'm content with the rest not knowing. But you mentioned the word agnosticism. I think you put it as local agnostic. And how would you define that?
Yeah, so this is always like a controversial one, and people are always gonna. It's always going to be difficult. People are going to disagree on the best way to use these terms, and I'm generally okay to just accept however people, want to use it. Like some people are going to say we can look at what's his name, like Baron de Holbach or whatever, with defining atheism as a lack of belief. So that's etymologically the best way of using it. Or some people are going to say, oh no, Gnostic. You want to like put it like a with an X and a Y axis, where it's kind of like, you've got Gnostic and agnostic, and then you've got atheism or theism. I like the way that sort of Paul Draper, who's a philosopher of religion, kind of divides up the use of these terms. And so there's kind of like, to be like a global agnostic would be someone who's taking the position that in principle, perhaps we can't know, where you can't know whether a deity does or doesn't exist. Whereas local agnosticism, I'm just taking the position basically about my own beliefs. I don't know. I'm not. I mean, I guess if you and this might be a good way of talking about it, like probabilistic. It's not that I'm like 50-50 or anything. If you ask me to like place a bet on it, I'd be against, especially with certain models of God, like various like Christian kind of ideas around God. I'd be pretty certain that type of God doesn't exist or isn't like a coherent concept. But I call myself agnostic because I keep myself open in principle, and I don't have all the answers. And my form of metaphysical naturalism that I hold to isn't like, look, I've got a complete theory of, like my ontology has everything that exists or something like that. That's not what I think.
Yeah. Gotcha. Yeah. And so it sounded like, I think I've heard the same thing described before as hard agnosticism versus weak agnosticism, or strong versus weak, hard versus soft. It's been described a couple of different ways, but I think I know what you mean. Agnosticism being one of those words that can mean knowledge of God is not possible and not attainable, or I just don't know. And it sounds like you're more in the I just don't know category.
Yeah, I'm more in the I don't know. But like I say, if you ask me to put a bet on it, it'd be against. I don't. Yeah.
Gotcha. Mr. Lewis, Dr. Lewis, Max. I'll call you Max just because you want to be identified as Max. What is ethics? What's the difference between ethics and morality? I think that those are terms, because you started talking about both, and I feel like those are two terms that people often confuse for each other. And so what are we talking about when we say ethics, and what do we mean by morality?
Sure. So I can't tell you what other people mean by those things. I can tell you, in general, philosophers use those terms interchangeably. There's just no difference for most people. So you'll find sometimes people will say that they're a professor of moral philosophy, or they work on moral philosophy or moral and political philosophy, and then some people work on ethics. I think some people use the term to refer to things like ethics is about lying, or about our interactions with other people, something along those lines. But as far as I'm concerned, I don't think that there's a clear difference. You find sometimes people talking about ethics in other fields. So there's a field or a topic in philosophy called ethics of belief. And on the one hand, sometimes it's about the morality of beliefs, but on the other hand, it sort of has to do with sort of the requirements of good belief or something like that. So sometimes I think ethics is used in this broader way. But the way that I speak and the way that I think most philosophers speak, it's just the same thing. It's about doing the right, wrong thing, being a good person. Those are the kind of topics or focus of ethics and morality.
Gotcha. And another reason I ask is because oftentimes in colloquial language, and this is the way that it was taught to me in psychology, where they do often distinguish between ethical principles and morality. Ethics is often defined in terms of a system of values or beliefs or positions about right and wrong that are imposed by a society or an organization. And so this is where we get medical ethics and congressional ethics and military ethics and all that sort of thing. Whereas morality seems to be more related to one's personal values. And so I have my own morality, but I exist as part of the medical world, where there is such a thing as medical ethics imposed onto everyone who's part of that field. And that's kind of the way that it tends to be described in those circumstances. But it sounds like from your position, for the purposes of these discussions, the two terms are really could be interchangeable.
Yeah, I guess I would say that when you talk about medical ethics, as just a for instance, these are, I guess, rules that you're bound to follow in virtue of being part of a profession. But it's not like the source of the requirements is, I don't know, from some agreement or something like that. It has to do with when you have certain powers or something like that, when you make a certain agreement to participate in some activity, then you have to agree to follow certain rules or something like that. So I take it that, I guess maybe there's the source of them is agreeing or something like that. Whereas when you might think, no, you have to sort of opt into them. Right. So like, I'm not bound by medical ethics in a certain sense because I'm not a doctor or a practitioner of medicine. But I think by and large, these things are on a par with the requirements we have to each other that we have not in virtue of any kind of profession we might have. Right. So I think perhaps you might think there's an explicit agreement in the case of medical ethics or professional ethics or congressional ethics. And then just, I don't know what we can argue about what the source of morality or ethics in general is, but I guess I take it that it's not an explicit agreement that you have with other people.
Is there a source of morality and ethics? Is there a single central source? How do we determine the difference between right and wrong? It feels like I intuitively know the answer to that, but it's an open question that philosophers, I think, have been wrestling with for forever. And so what is your perspective on that? How do we know what is ethical and what is not?
Sure. So that's a great question. So I think you asked a couple of things. So the first is, what's the source of ethics or morality? And I take that to be a question about like, what makes it true that there are moral facts? So facts about what's right and wrong in the world. And there's a whole field of philosophy called metaethics, and part of metaethics, particularly moral metaphysics, is dedicated to sort of arguing about what the source is. A lot of people think that, and maybe I can just say very briefly what the kind of broad views are. So some people obviously say that there are no facts, right? So these are anti-realists about morality. But by and large, people are realists, and then once they agree that there are moral facts, then they disagree about where they come from. So some people will actually take a view similar to what I said before about medical ethics. They'll think that it has to do with hypothetical agreement amongst people. So some people will take what's thought of as a constructivist view, which is that we sort of construct moral facts ourselves. And that has to do with what we would hypothetically agree to. There's a version of that on which the source is what we would hypothetically agree to were we being fully rational. So these are the two possibilities. Some people think it's just kind of mysterious, that they think there are just moral facts, that these are necessary truths about all possible worlds. So they have the kind of ontological status as things like mathematical facts. Mm-hmm. I think I put myself in that camp. Do I have a great argument for that? A positive argument? Not really. But I take it that anytime people try to pose arguments against it, I think what a lot of philosophers do is they look to mathematics to see that any kind of argument you would give against morality being a set of necessary facts about the world, if you argue about that, you're going to end up indicting, I guess, mathematics, and a lot of people think that that's bad. This is what's called something like a companions and guilt argument. So you sort of overreach if you try to argue that there is no source of morality. So I think those are some broad views about the source of moral facts. It is very controversial, I should say. The second question you asked was, how do we determine what's right and wrong, or what is right and wrong? So what things are right and what things are wrong? So with regard to that, I think that's normally handled by what's called normative ethics or first order ethics. And these are questions about, so you can just agree that there are moral facts, and you can just sort of put to the side what the source of those facts are. And then it's a separate question, how do we determine what things are actually right and wrong, or which things are actually right and wrong? And so that's, yeah, like I said, it's a question of normative ethics. And in there, I'm sure you're familiar with the broad range of views. So some people will say it has to do with achieving certain states like happiness and pleasure, at least for most people or for all people, or some aggregation of happiness or pleasure. Some people think it has to do with respecting things like autonomy and freedom of the will. Other people think it's a more simple thing, like don't do harm, do good to other people, things like that. And so when you have these kind of,
which you mentioned, those are not necessarily mutually exclusive. Like sometimes those all go together, right?
That's absolutely true. So there's one of my favorite moral philosophers, whose name is W.D. Ross. He had a view which tried to put things like these together. He had things that he called prima facie duties, which are, these are things that, like, technically speaking, this is not the right term, but what he had in mind was this. You have a bunch of things that are like principles, like don't do harm, do good, be beneficent, be just. And when you're trying to decide what to do, you have lots of these, what you can call competing claims. So sometimes when we're doing things, you might have to hurt somebody, but ultimately it's a good thing for them or something like that. So if you have to save somebody from a burning car or something like that, maybe you have to injure them a little bit, but that seems to violate the claim that you shouldn't do any harm to people. But then, of course, you're saving their life. So people like this thought, what you should do is there's just a bunch of considerations in each kind of moral case that you'll have to figure out what is right and wrong, and you sort of weigh them against each other. How you do that is extremely controversial, and a lot of people think the main weakness of views like this is trying to figure out exactly how we're going to weigh up different moral reasons. So that's a question of, the normative ethics is about how you figure out what's right and wrong. And then another question you ask, which is, how do we figure out what's right and wrong? Right? So, like, how do you and me, as we're going about the world, try to figure that out? And that fits squarely in another part of metaethics, which is moral epistemology, which is the study of rational moral beliefs or moral knowledge. And in those, there's just, like anything else in ethics, there's a bunch of views. They disagree with each other. Some people think you can't have moral knowledge. Some people think that any kind of justification you have for moral knowledge is going to be undermined by things like confounding factors of evolution and culture and things like that. So it becomes very difficult to sort of figure out, like, what's the best way of doing it. Like with most things, I tend to go for a more common sense view. So I think things like you gain moral knowledge in much the way that you gain other knowledge. You can sort of see in some sense that things are right and wrong. Of course, some things are very complicated, and for that you have to sort of reason through it. I take it that the most reliable way to figure out what's right and wrong is to sort of list out what all the morally relevant features are of a case. See how strong you think they are. See if you think that they sort of cancel out or outweigh what else is going on in the case. Now, of course, that isn't a precise thing, which is unfortunate, but I take it in a lot of cases, there's going to be an intuitive balance of reasons in favor of one thing or the other.
Gotcha. So Nathan, I'm curious, what is your perspective on morality, and how is it different now that you consider yourself agnostic versus when you considered yourself Christian? How would you say that your perspective on morality has changed as you've gone through different worldviews? So, and you can tell me what your perspective was at each stage.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I suppose I will preface anything I say with, I think that ethics is a moral philosophy in general is very difficult, and I've come to lots of different conclusions which I've kind of found convincing at the time, and then I've been like, oh no, but there's this problem for it, there's that, and it's really very difficult to put together an entire kind of theory that's going to deal with in virtue of what a moral facts like true or false, or if they're not true and false, like why is that the case, how should we act in general, how should we act in particular cases. It's really, really difficult to account for all that, and I think maybe even Peter Singer, who's an ethicist, I think one of his sort of primary points to kind of get through some of the kind of disagreement between philosophers was just to say, if you're in this situation, you have to make a choice between this and that. You can just kind of see what the right thing is to do, and I think that moral philosophy might be a bit like that. Like there's something really important about just being able to see what the right thing is to do in a particular situation. And sometimes I think armchair theorizing can kind of get away from that a little bit, which is maybe that's how my opinions changed over time. So as a Christian, I was very interested in William Lane Craig's moral argument for God. If God does not exist, then there cannot be objective moral facts and values. Objective moral facts and values do exist. So by modus tollens, God exists, and obviously that's a valid argument, right? So if the premises are true, the conclusion is going to be true. But it's like, what's the story that we're actually telling about why that conditional is true? Because if we look at like the Phil Papers survey, for example, it seems like most professional philosophers who take that survey seem to not be Christians, and yet most of them are moral realists, which means that they believe that moral facts are, truth apt, and that, well, maybe some of them don't, but a lot of them seem to believe also that, there can be true moral facts, there can be a really good thing to do in any particular situation, let's say. So it seems like that there's more to the kind of story than what the Christian's offering. Now, William Lane Craig and his idea of what God is, his idea of what moral facts are, is also very different from a lot of historical Christianity, for example. So a lot of Christians have been Platonists historically. This means that they've believed in these kind of like abstract forms of things. So there might be terms that we use in language, like tables and chairs, or the number 3. And a lot of Christians throughout history have kind of been heavily influenced by well, also by Aristotle as well, but influenced by the idea that these kind of forms exist, and they might be like ideas there might be like these ideas in God's mind, maybe for some of them. There's various different models, but William Lane Craig's opposed to that idea, so that's kind of off the table for him in discussing what good is. So as a Christian, I was kind of wrestling with these different models of God. What makes goodness is clearly identified with God in some sense, but. And I couldn't, the thing that I really struggled with, basically, I think was more that I couldn't make sense of what makes things good or bad on a kind of naturalist story of reality, because goodness or badness seems to be, more like the number 3. It seems to be like this kind of abstraction in some sense. I can't like measure it with a ruler or something like that. So, I guess I wanted to, so I'd put that in this category of like weird kind of philosophical things that can have something to do with God in my sort of metaphysics of what's going on in reality. I think over time that was one of the last things to kind of go about my theistic beliefs, was this idea that morality was something that's divine. Now, that's not to say that I have a complete picture now, but I think like talking about meta-ethics, what in virtue of what are some of these facts true? Like there's an emotivist or a prescriptivist story, for example, that I could tell about reality, which would be to say, rather than these things being truth apt, I might be sort of describing my own emotional state. So sort of more like saying boo to that thing that I don't like, or hooray to that thing that I like, or I might be prescribing a course of action to others. Those accounts can make sense of it, and then some people like Simon Blackburn try to kind of tie the threads together and say you can have like a quasi realism that's like aspects of this, but facts are true in virtue of other things. I don't really know. I'm not here to say like this is the right meta ethic, this is the right, and I'm more inclined to think it's sort of like I'm more inclined to think in the applied kind of cases, at least, that there's some combination of various things going on. Like there might be a bit of like how can we increase pleasure amongst kind of the people who are involved in some sense. There might be a bit of like duty. There might be a bit of like, how do you develop a virtuous character going on? And there might be like various rules that are kind of derived from this. I think, and this is where I just think ethics is very complex, but it wasn't something that I don't think I could appreciate it in that sense as a Christian, because within Christianity, it was like these facts are clear. Everything is clearly
it's very black and white,
right or wrong. Exactly. And for a lot of things, there's divine commandments, and you've got this whole the epistemology is different as well. So rather than ethics being this difficult thing that we engage with, it's like, well, the Holy Spirit's going to guide you into all truth and understanding as you read the Bible around a particular issue, for example. Or you can, depending on your denomination and theology, you can consult church leadership, maybe people up the chain who are I mean, it's not going to be true for all denominations, but who are kind of like closer to God or have better like pastoral advice are going to be able to help you out with that. Whereas I think now, I don't think that's true. I don't think that's a good way of a reliable way of forming true beliefs, because it seems, like denominations, for example, who are all informed by the Holy Spirit, come to radically different questions on, like whether gay people should be allowed to get married in the church or have communion. So I'd say that's probably not. That's not a part of my moral epistemology anymore. But now what I do on these questions is I have to really like think about things. But then it comes. I think it does come down to reality. Like when there's actions that I've got to take that are moral in life, I'm like it just kind of comes down to my moral intuitions fundamentally. But I like to think about these things. So I don't have a complete story to tell you. Life's got more complicated since leaving theism, but I also think I'm able to honestly engage with those answers around morality and ethics much more than I was in Christianity, where I was probably doing some things that I think are probably immoral as a result of thinking I had, this easy answer for everything.
Sure. And I guess I have a question for both of you. And you mentioned William Lane Craig a few minutes ago, and the argument he made, the moral argument for God. He has this syllogism about, if without God, there's no objective moral values. Objective moral values exist, therefore God exists. And you talked about how that was a valid argument. Is it a sound argument? And if not, why not?
Well, I don't think so, because I think there's plenty of stories you can tell that. So basically, sorry, Max, I'll be short, and then you can talk, because I think you know much more about this than me. But basically, all he's saying there is, if God exists, subjective moral facts and values exist, and he's going to tell you a particular story about what makes that true. But by doing, by just taking any kind of moral philosophy course in a philosophy degree, you're going to find about all these other stories that can account for objective moral facts and values without God existing. We might become moral Platonists. We might become some sort of like Aristotelians of some sort. We might become like Cornell realists. There's all sorts of things on the table. And then the question is, when we sort of paint these pictures, which of them best fits the data, which of them has the fewest logical commitments and so forth. And it seems like Craig's doesn't kind of win out when we do that. But yeah.
It seems to me like a begging the question fallacy, which is why I like to ask other people. But what's your perspective on that, Max?
Yeah, so probably unsurprisingly, I'm not compelled by that. I don't feel very compelled by that. So I think some of the stuff Nathan said is absolutely correct. Look, the main problem is the claim that you can only have objective morality unless you have God. I a couple of things you want to ask is, what's the story there? So why is that true? So I think part of telling that story would be pointing to other probable sources, and then having to argue that none of them are possible. I take it that maybe a long time ago when I did religious studies, I read some Craig, and I think I read this argument. And quite honestly, I don't remember what he says. But I take it that you're going to have to argue that none of the other possibilities work. The only possibility has to be that God does it. I take it that also he has a very particular view in mind, which is the divine command theory, which is that God sort of issues commands, and in virtue of issuing those commands, these things become moral facts. So God says, don't lie. It becomes a fact that you shouldn't lie. But you can think of, just ask yourself, is that the only possible way you can think of it being the case that it's just true that you shouldn't lie objectively? I guess I should say before I move on, what's meant by objective. So I take it that what's meant is something like mind independence. So what that means is it's a fact not just because people believe it's true, not just because they've agreed upon that thing. It's sort of like above the sort of mind or something like that. So we don't have to have any agreement. It's just like mathematical facts are objectively true. It doesn't matter if anybody believes that 2 + 2 = 4. It's just a fact. So I take it that what Craig has in mind is something like that. Doesn't matter what people believe. It's a fact that you shouldn't lie. What explains that? I guess God commanded it. So I guess one thing I'd think of is why did God command that? That seems like a perfectly legitimate question. So that'll bring you into what's called the Euthyphro Dilemma, which is basically you ask yourself the question, does God command it because it's right, or is it right because God commands it? This is from Plato's dialogue, the Euthyphro. And I think the thought that a lot of people have is, well, think about why God would have commanded it, right? So think about lying or something like that. And you can think of a perfectly naturalistic explanation of why you would not want to allow lying. Why? Because it deceives people. Why is that wrong? Well, it sort of treats them as tools, right? You can think of sort of people have sort of like their autonomy, their free choice. They have the sort of right to do certain things. And when you lie to them, you sort of mess with that. You can also think about maybe a clearer case, a case that is perhaps like less socially motivated, is things like murder. So why is murder wrong? It seems like a lot easier to justify something like that. It's something like, look, people are valuable, right? These are things with minds, intelligence, free will, just a great source of value. We can say
not
that
on Craig's view as well. Aside from God's commands, people are not valuable on Craig's view. That's sorry to interject.
Oh no, he doesn't think people are valuable in themselves.
No intrinsic value aside from God's commands.
Oh, okay. Well, that's a strange view. Okay. Well,
it is. I would say that is a sort of a strange view, but as a former Christian myself, who was taught that we were all born into a fallen state and we're all born sinners, and it is only through the grace of God that any of us receive salvation. It's not that much of a stretch. I mean, if you're used to having this view of humanity as basically a piece of shit, because that's what your religion, that those were your beliefs, I don't think it's that much of a stretch to consider the lack of value of human beings, at least compared to the God that you're believing in.
Yeah, sure. Once you have the background belief about the God, now I can see why that would be somewhat plausible. Anyways, just to sort of wrap up, I guess, like with most philosophical arguments, there's going to be some problems with it. I think, in particular, Craig's argument, there's just going to be many, many problems. So, like I said, you're going to have to defend a particular view of what makes things right because God exists, right? It's not just like God exists and then nothing else, and then there's moral facts, right? So then you have to defend a particular view about how you get from God to facts. That's the divine command theory. There's problems with that. The Euthyphro Dilemma that I mentioned, that's super famous. Lots of intro to philosophy classes teach it. Intro to ethics teaches it. then you have to ask yourself, well, what are the other options for having an objective morality or objective ethics without God? There's going to be a lot, I think, plausible views on that. You might also want to just give up on the objective morality. So you want to be very, very precise about what you have in mind when you say objective. So maybe most people think, oh, it can't be a fact unless it's objective. But the way that people are using objective in this sense is, like I said, mind independent. So, and it's not based on agreements amongst people. But you might have the view that moral facts come about because of either hypothetical or actual agreements amongst people. You can think of the case of promising. This is one case where, that you should keep a promise doesn't become true because you promise, but that you ought to keep that promise is true because you've made a promise to somebody and you have some kind of implicit agreement with them, right? So you can sort of bring about moral facts. One
of the interesting, before you got too far away from it, I'm very interested in this idea of objective morality and really the arguments for it, because as we define objectivity and the way they use it, independent from a mind, I've always looked at morality as a judgment between the difference between, right and wrong or good and evil. And as long as morality is a judgment, I don't see how it could be objective, because judgments necessitate a mind. Even if it's the mind of God, it would still seem to be subjective to the God. And, we don't have to agree with whatever God exists to make these moral pronouncements. But just the fact that we can disagree with them would seem to suggest that morality is subjective, even if it does come from a God. So I never understood how objective morality works, even from that perspective, that there's a God who issues moral pronouncements. It sounds like you're not really talking about a judgment of right and wrong anymore. You're talking about just divine command theory, which is the authority and power of a God. It's right because the person in charge said so.
I guess I was thinking of morality as like the sort of set of moral principles that are true, or set of moral facts. And so there's plenty of facts, you can say, that are objective, so mathematical facts, physical facts, that kind of stuff.
Right.
But I think morality is often talked about as like your own morality, which is your own set of moral beliefs. So of course, in that sense, it's definitely subjective because it's your own judgments.
Right.
And I take it that, but what you want from your judgments is you want your judgments to match the actual facts. But so that's what I had in mind. So I think, at least I'm of the opinion that there shouldn't be anything in principle odd about objective morality. Although once you try to spell out exactly how you can get it, I think that's when it becomes a little bit more difficult.
Yeah. And for me, I guess, I recognize that there are certain values that people share in common, that people agree to, but that wouldn't necessarily make it objective. I tend to, my views on morality tend to align with someone like Matt Dillahunty. I'm not sure if you're familiar with him. He's pretty prominent atheist host of the Atheist Experience, and so I've had a couple of conversations with him before. But and I think he's even stealing that position from someone else. I can't remember, but his position is that morality is based on well-being. And that makes sense to me, because that seems to be the thing that we all want in common, generally speaking. And if it's not about well-being, well, then why even have it? And, so when you're talking about all of the things that make something right and wrong, I don't think morality has any meaning unless there's a goal. And I think that the goals are subjectively chosen, but well-being seems to be a goal that most people share in common. So if that's your goal, then what's right for me is well-being, and we sort of look at the things, look at the behaviors that either advance or promote well-being versus the behaviors that cause harm. I don't know. What do you think about that, Nathan? Is that how you viewed morality as a Christian? Did you view it as just this objective thing that was a moral pronouncement from God, and that's what morality meant? Or did you view it as more of a subjective take on personal values?
Yeah, I think as a Christian, I sort of always, I would have, said that I thought divine command theory was true and kind of told you this philosophical story. But I think I always had a hard time with how God's commandments could make moral facts true of the world. Like I was sort of like, well, like, so say God, however many thousand years ago, commanded, don't do this and this. Well, how does that make it true that if I do that now, it's a bad thing? Or I kind of struggled with the story for a lot of reasons, and I don't think I ever quite bought it. But what I did buy was this idea that that goodness did exist, because I had this really strong intuition, sort of as strong as that this table's in front of me or something, but that I couldn't successfully reduce it to some natural state of affairs. I couldn't tell you about the way that electrons were arranged or something and somehow figure out what goodness was from that. So I kind of shoved it into this ontological slum that I'm going to call it of theism, where just everything that was weird kind of lives. But I think with the well-being thing, I think well-being is good, but we can always sort of ask the question, is good well-being, and come up with these cases where it doesn't seem to be, we seem to be sort of getting the most well-being out of a situation, like a thought experiment or something, but also what's being done by people in those circumstances is bad. And so I think it sort of partially tracks the concept that we're trying to get after with good, but just not fully. So I wouldn't go. I think I don't know if Matt is getting his ideas from Sam Harris, and I've kind of got it.
I think he's admitted that. So yeah,
I think Sam Harris has got at the moment. I think Sam Harris has got some cool and interesting ideas, but I also would kind of disagree with him on a lot of his ethics. He says stuff I've bridged the is-ought gap, which isn't really something to be bridged. It just is kind of a description of the way things are. And his argument has hidden premises, and he's kind of and if you don't agree with me, put your hand on a stove or whatever. And it's well, that doesn't kind of make your facts true. That and someone actually has put that, a moral philosopher has put their hand on a stove as a joke to prove Sam Harris wrong there. So I think it's definitely got something to do with it. When we're talking about what's right and wrong, we're definitely we want pleasure, we want well-being for people, but it's just that I don't think there's this perfect identity between the two sort of thing. It's there's some other stuff in there, those cases where there's say there's 5 people in a situation who all get great psychological well-being out of like torturing someone or whatever, and so their well-being really increases in this situation too. I'm just thinking off the top of my head, but for
me, I understand that, because for me the debate really isn't about what morality ought to be about. I recognize that morality, as far as anyone that I've ever talked to, when they've described it, they seem to be talking about some form of well-being. I think the difference is how they're defining well-being. What do you consider well-being to be? Whose well-being? Well-being to what level? And we have different ideas about this. And I think that that's where some of the different theories of morality, we're talking about utilitarianism and Kantian theory and all of these theories that have come about to try to resolve moral dilemmas. When I look at something like divine command theory, that doesn't seem to help me solve moral dilemmas. That seems to be the least useful one in terms of solving any moral dilemma. And so I personally reject that one. I've never liked virtue ethics because I think a lot of it is question begging. What is virtuous? Why is this virtuous? It seems to be assumed that certain behaviors are more virtuous than others for reasons. But my moral worldview, I steal from a lot of different theories of morality to try to resolve moral dilemmas. And I don't know. I think that that's kind of the best that we can do. I've never really liked this idea of common sense or self-evident morality, because it seems to not be, on the one hand, common sense seems like it's a thing, it's intuitive. We understand that murder is wrong. So it works for things like murder and rape and the really heinous crimes. But then you start getting to things that are questioned, like, homosexuality or or polygamy or veganism, and things where different societies have very different conclusions, and one thing seems self-evidently moral to one society and completely immoral to another, and so I don't like appealing to common sense in that way. And I think that a lot of people who make arguments for objective morality or divine command theory use common sense to try to say, hey, this is true because everyone knows it's true. But what about when they don't?
Yeah. From I guess from my point of view, when I do metaphysics in general, I'm really in favor of like naturalizing things. And so, I want everything really to be informed by the sciences. But the one area that I'm kind of oppose that is in ethics, is with morality. And I can't put my finger on quite why that is. I think it's because I've got these really strong intuitions, and there's a point in time where you could have told me things about like physics or the way that maths is that would have overridden some like earlier kind of model of how that works, and I'd be like, oh yeah, I just had it wrong before. Like I thought all triangles have interior angles of 180 degrees, just like Kant. I was really certain this was true, and then I figured out, oh, actually, you can kind of like curve the triangle, and then on the convex side, the angles it's gonna be less than 180 degrees, and on the concave side, it's gonna be more. And I didn't have an intuition about that, but I had a really strong intuition that all angles have 180 degrees. I guess I could be wrong in that same way about morality, and I've got to have that skepticism. But there's something I don't know what it is. It seems like when you go down that road with ethics and you start painting this really rigid story about like this is the way it is, but then and if you start trying to live that out in the world, you kind of get like weird evil things happening, I think, when you do that. And so I oppose that in my metaphysics, and I don't know why. I don't have like an answer to give you about
Max.
It's difficult.
It seems like you talked about the Euthyphro dilemma, and it always seemed to me that one of the reasons it's a dilemma is because any answer you give becomes problematic or becomes another problem to be resolved. It's not as easy as things are good because God says so, or God says things are good because they're good. You still have to have kind of an answer for one or the other. Is that how you see it? Is this a question that will ever actually be answered, or are we doomed, so to speak, to continually ask the question forever?
I guess so. The way I was thinking of it, it was more of a sort of dialectical problem for people that were in favor of divine command theory. So I think, there could be an answer. So let me just say it again, and then I can tell you what the sort of next step is supposed to be. Right. So, God says something is wrong, and then the question is, does he say it's wrong because it's wrong? Or is it wrong? Sorry, is it wrong because he says it's wrong, or does he say it's wrong because it's actually wrong? Mm-hmm. Something along those lines. And the idea is like, if his saying it makes it wrong, then you might think like, well, what happens if he said that something else was wrong? What happens if he said that, eating ice cream on Sunday was wrong? And then people will think, no, that's absurd. That's just not something that's wrong. Mm-hmm. And the other idea is that, okay, if he says it's wrong for some other reason, right? If there's a reason he says it's wrong, then whatever that reason is, that's the true source of the wrongness, right? In either case, it looks like that's not going to be good for the theist, right? So on the one hand, it looks like then God's commands are just arbitrary, and then if he's just arbitrarily giving commands, that doesn't seem like we should be taking those as facts or acting, in accordance with them. It seems like they lose their authority once we find out that they're arbitrary. And then if we find out that there's some further reason that he's giving them, then it looks like that's the source of morality, not his saying them. So then it becomes like God's giving you advice. And it could be good advice, but he's not making it true. So I think the way I was thinking of it is that it looks like on either what's called horn of the dilemma, if either side of it's wrong, correct, the theist is in trouble. They have something more to answer for. I guess I would just say that, of course, I don't think there is a God, but if there was a God and he was making commands, I would think and his commands were actually true, well, commands can't be true, but let's just say the prescriptions he was making were the right prescriptions. I would think the reason that he's making them is because there's some other reason that he's privy to, and that's why he's making them. That's what, I think that's.
And really, the Euthyphro dilemma is it's only a dilemma for God believers because it presumes the existence of a God in the first place. And so if you're not believing in a God, there actually is no such dilemma for you. You have other moral dilemmas that you have to resolve in other ways. I guess the last thing I'll say on that is the deceptive demon, the evil demon argument, is what I think about when someone brings up divine command. One of the questions I like to ask theists who are believing in divine command theory as their, moral worldview, what if God was evil? Would you know? And I don't see a solution to that. If God is evil, but he's calling evil things good, you would have no way of knowing the difference. You're just calling something good because the evil demon says it's good, like slavery, for example. Like, how do you figure out whether slavery is right or wrong if your entire framework is based on what the God is telling you? So I guess that wasn't really a question. That was just my final thought. But we are coming up to the top of the hour, and I really appreciate both of you coming on. Like I said, this is my premiere episode, and I couldn't think of a better way to start it. Hopefully I get to have each one of you on here again in the future. I absolutely invite you to come back anytime you're available.
Thank you.
Yeah. And was there anything is there anything that you guys wanted to plug as far as, I mentioned your background, but I don't know if you have any books or sources or upcoming projects that you wanted to plug before I let you go.
Do you want to go, Max?
I don't have anything like that. No. I'm just a lowly researcher. So I guess you could go, if you were interested in the stuff I work on, which is not directly related to this stuff, at least at the moment, you could go to my website, which is max-lewis.com. You can see my CV and some of the stuff I'm working on. But I'm afraid I don't have anything too entertaining on the website.
I suspect that you may in the future, but either way, I'm happy to have you back anytime.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. And how about you, Nathan?
I've got my YouTube channel, Digital Gnosis, and a lot of the interviews from that are in podcast form. So on like iTunes, Spotify, Google podcasts and stuff. A lot of philosophy interviews, a couple of New Testament history ones and things like that, if people are interested. And also, tomorrow we're doing a series called Bad Apologetics, where we look at various kind of arguments and styles that apologists will use. We're looking at presuppositionalism and its history, so through Cornelius Van Til and Greg Bonson, and how they've kind of butchered the idea of Kant's transcendental argument for God to arrive at people just telling you, you can't have logic and facts and things on your worldview. So God exists, basically. So we're gonna be looking at that tomorrow, and also I've got an interview with a guy called Matthew Cobb, who's just written a book called A History of the Idea of the Brain this month, and a debate between James Fodor and Inspiring Philosophy on whether quantum physics leads to a particular idealist model of God as well. So those are things, if you're interested in any of those, head over to Digital Gnosis.
Thanks a lot for that. And I am interested. And so I will definitely be checking out some of that stuff. But thanks again, guys, for coming on. And for those of you watching, if you've enjoyed this show, please hit the like button and consider subscribing. We plan on having similar content upcoming. Each episode will be a little bit different. We'll be tackling a different issue. But I had a great time. I appreciate our guests. I'm looking forward to seeing them in the future. And for Skids the Clown and Director Wes, this is Bryce Aroni asking you to have your God spayed or neutered. You guys enjoy that one?
I love that outro.
Well done. Well done.
Well done to you, sir.
I didn't do anything.
You
Just like
did.
all the work.
You did everything. You really did. You really did. Sir, boss man,
Oh, easy.
I'm talking to you.
Easy. Well, everybody, welcome to Tang. I got used to not saying the Atheist Round Table every time. Welcome to Tang. And first of all, I know producer Wes is backstage, but Wes, Bryce Aroni, Skid the Clown, congratulations. First show on Tang. I'm excited, man. I'm excited. I was trying to make sure I was engaged in my show, but I was like, oh, they're live. I want to watch. So
We were pseudo live.
Yeah.
I was back and forth, but no, congratulations, guys. Very, very excited. And I got to watch a little bit of that, beforehand. So I had a good idea what was going on, but congratulations. And for everybody that's watching in the chat right now, thank you for hanging out tonight. And this being the first, as Bryce said, the pseudo live version. We will continue even on Tuesdays and Thursdays with Bryce and Skid and Wes's show. Still have the engagement at the end, the personal engagement. That way, there's questions or anything like that on the topics that they're talking about, that you can still do that. And I think that's important, especially for new shows to the channel. So you can count on this every Tuesday night. Well, not this. The other ones will be live. But you can count on seeing and hearing from Bryce every Tuesday, and then seeing and hearing from Skids every Thursday, and then Wes. Whenever Wes, he's the real boss. Whenever Wes decides to show his face, you'll.
Wes,
He's a little shy.
There he is.
But no, I did want to pop in. I am not here to steal the spotlight, but I did want to say now that with the first premiere / live, love you guys. I'm so glad you're a part. Welcome to the team, and I'm looking forward to home run after home run, grand slam after grand slam that you guys are going to hit. And you guys are exceptional additions to the team.
No pressure there.
Yeah, exactly.
No pressure.
Thank you,
at all.
boss. We appreciate it very much.
I'm glad you guys are here.
Awesome. Thank you so much. We appreciate it.
Appreciate you guys.
Thanks. So, well, before we get to, we had a couple of questions in there, and I think there's still some people hanging out in the chat. But
looks like it. Do you have any of the questions written down? I've only got one written down, but I can give it to you whenever you're ready.
Well, I saw that Change is Good asked a question. I think before that, None asked a question, and I'm not sure if this is rhetorical or not. What law did God impose on itself? And that's an interesting question, because God is the giver of the laws, and so really he wouldn't be subjected to his own laws. I'm going off of the Christian biblical model, and I'm reaching back to my putting on my Christian apologist hat to try to think of a good way a Christian might answer this question. Since God is the giver of law, he cannot commit sin, because sin would be a transgression against God's law, right? And he's the giver of God. He's the giver of law. So he can't transgress his own laws, which means that he hasn't imposed any laws on himself. That's one way a Christian might answer the question. Someone else might say, well, he is confined by the laws of nature, which he created. So, he created nature in a certain way to where, or I guess a better thing to say would be the rules of logic. He created the rules of logic, and therefore he cannot do logically contradictory things. That would be something that some Christians would agree to and others would disagree to. Some would say that God can do logically contradictory things, which doesn't seem to make sense to me, but I have heard that argued before by other.
Yeah, I've heard it argued both ways. So
yeah. So I'm not really sure if that answers the question. Obviously, as an agnostic atheist who when you read the Bible as an atheist without all of the religious baggage, and you can evaluate it kind of more objectively, you can see that one, you're reading it for what it actually says, you're not going off of the script of the church. God doesn't really, he's kind of a hypocrite,
Yeah.
He imposes laws on his creations. Sometimes the laws seem like they make sense. Sometimes they don't make any sense at all. Sometimes he enforces the laws. Other times he doesn't. Many times he does the very things that he's calling wrong if you do them. But when he does the same thing, he's calling them okay. He's calling them good. So there seems to be definitely a lot of inconsistency with the laws. Thou shalt not murder from the 10 Commandments. Okay, but then when you have God ordering men to kill others unjustly, that is murder. You're not calling it murder in this case because you're commanding the person to violate the commandment, and so it becomes okay. But if you're going to call it wrong, if it's immoral anytime other than when you tell the person to do it, well, then it's not intrinsically immoral. You're just kind of picking and choosing who you want to murder.
Right. But I mean, isn't the whole point of justifying killing is to make it so it's moral? I mean, that's literally why you justify anything, is to make it a moral action.
Yeah. I mean, morality is about what's right and wrong. But when you look at the commandments, they're really not addressing morality at all. They're just commandments. Laws don't tell you what's moral. They just tell you what's allowed. So it's basically God saying, I'm allowing this, that, and the other. I don't allow these things. Okay, cool. But you haven't told me whether it's moral or not. And you haven't even given me a way to evaluate these laws to see if they are moral. You're just telling me they are because you're God.
Exactly. So it looks like I got another question from None. See if I can show this up here. Look at that. Which came first, objective facts or moral perspective?
I'm not really sure what you're getting at there. Objective facts are they're facts and they're objective, and so they exist. As far as I would say, just based on that, objective facts came first, because in order for there to be a moral perspective, there has to be a perspective. And we know that moral facts existed before humanity existed, or before any of the animals existed, to have a perspective on anything. There had to be a world that objectively existed for life to evolve on. And then life evolved. And then you had creatures that came along with brains that were advanced. So, thinking agency came along to have a perspective on the world. So from looking at it that way, then the certain objective facts preceded any perspective. And I don't know if that's where they were going with that, but that's my answer. And I don't see a good defeater to that. So I'm going to go ahead and say that I'm right on that.
That's the name of the show, so I think it's okay.
That's the name of the game, yeah.
Okay, and I know you mentioned this one, so it's kind of a long one. Change is good asked, could living as a moral person be simplified by stating one who lives in such a way intentionally as to do no harm physically, emotionally, or mentally to another person, or to another, is a moral person?
So I would say that the answer to that is yes, it could be simplified that way. But you run into two issues. There's a second question that comes up. Must you simplify it that way, or should you simplify it that way? You're going to get people that agree or disagree. Some people would say, no, that's too simplistic. That doesn't allow you to resolve moral dilemmas. Other people would say, no, I just completely disagree. The most simple way to define morality would be divine command theory, what God says. I don't think that those are very strong arguments. I think that the best way to define what living as a moral person would be exactly as you put it. Change is good. I'm not sure if I'm speaking to a male or female, but whatever the case may be, that is a great way to put it. And that is certainly that's part of my moral framework, by recognizing that, it's about well-being. So But again, that just tells us what morality is. That tells us what it means to live as a moral person. It doesn't really complete the picture. It doesn't allow us to evaluate all moral claims or tell us how we should evaluate all moral claims. We're still going to come across moral dilemmas. And so you need some sort of, you need a little bit more to that framework to help you figure that out, because what does it mean to be, what happens when you get into the situation where you have your physical harm is in conflict with your physical well-being is in conflict with your emotional well-being. There are people who cut themselves because they are in emotional distress. So they cause themselves physical distress and cause physical damage to sort of alleviate the emotional distress, Now we call that harmful behavior. Obviously it is, but we only see the physical harm, not necessarily the emotional distress that leads to that. And so I would say that because you have those sorts of conflicts, there are people who, we don't even have to go to anything that extreme. Let's just talk about people who are binge eaters or just eat a lot, They're causing harm, but it makes them feel good at the same time, So just you have a conflict between what's making you physically feel good and the diabetes and heart disease you're setting yourself up for in the future. But somebody who is addicted to food doesn't necessarily want to hear that. They just want to satisfy that hunger. So is that a morality discussion? A lot of people would consider that amoral, but if your morality is based on well-being and you recognize that you are causing harm to yourself, are you immoral for doing that?
Yeah, exactly. So that looks like about all the questions we have right now. So do you have any final thoughts for the evening?
Not really. I'm really happy with, first of all, I want to thank our guests, Max and Nathan. They're not here right now, but I thought that they were great guests, and they spoke really eloquently and intelligently about ethics and morality, but in a simplified way that was digestible to the layman,
Absolutely. Yeah. And just so everybody knows, just because this is the first show that Bryce put together, we do not plan on doing every show as a pre-record like this. So this kind of was the way that these two guests, as we were making our transition over to the Tang network, we kind of needed to film them before we got everything set up. So starting next week, you are planning on going fully live on the show, correct?
We will be fully live next week. We will be fully live most weeks. We may do a pre-record every now and again, just if we have conflicts with timing to where, because I'm also doing another show over on Promethean Secular Frontier, you're doing a couple of other shows. And sometimes we run into conflicts that way where, guests have to be there at different hours, different days. But for the most part, we're going to be live and we will minimize our pre-records. There's the Murder Shirt Steve, my scary guy, and I have a man crush on him, but scared of him at the same time. So that's kind of a weird dynamic there. But yeah, I thanks to everyone, one, for tuning in and watching, and also for the questions. I think that those were pretty good questions. Some of them were open, so I can't say that I was right about them, but a couple of them I was definitely right about.
Perfect. And yeah, just a little bit more information for you. The premiere of Faith Not Included, which is my show, will not be this Thursday, but the following Thursday. We're still doing some production on that one. So we're hoping next week we get a live show from Bryce and then a hybrid live pre-record for my first show. So looking forward to that. With that, Bryce, I'll let you sign us off.
Don't forget to have your gods spayed and neutered.
Thanks, everyone.